So thank you all very much for joining us. My name is Alex Mills. I'm a professor here in the faculty, and I'll be chairing this chat. But the star of the show, of course, is Professor Martins Paparinskis, and we're very glad that Martins could make the time to join us this event this evening. So Martins is a generalist public international lawyer with special expertise in international investment law, but with a very wide range of interests. Despite having a DPhil from Oxford, he's gone on to achieve many very impressive things, indeed too many to mention in an introduction. But most importantly, for the purposes of this evening, he's now a member of the International Law Commission and has been since the start of the year. Congratulations, Martins, on your appointment. Yeah. So the format for this event is really a fireside chat. Our application to have a fire was denied on health and safety grounds, unfortunately, but so we'll have a conversation first and then leave time for some questions at the end. And broadly speaking, we're going to start with some general discussion about the International Law Commission and its role and its function, and then move on to some of the specific topics that the International Law Commission's been working on during this last year. So just to kick things off, I'm not sure everyone here will know very much about the International Law Commission. So I wonder if you could just begin by explaining what the International Law Commission is and what it does.
Well, thank you, Alex, for the very kind and not at all qualified word of introduction. International Law Commission is a body that fits within the broader family of the United Nations. It is a subsidiary organ of the United Nations General Assembly. So one of, I suppose, the more loosely one can say the more legislative bodies, to the extent that one can use that analogy. And one of the mandates of the General Assembly is to engage in development of international law, and to carry that out. The General Assembly created the International Law Commission. So this is, by way of architecture, that is where International Law Commission fits within the bigger world. And I think it sounds like a bit of an introductory point that one makes in the beginning of the class. It is a subsidiary organ of the General Assembly before we go on to think about the really interesting things. But I think it does matter to understand what the International Law Commission does, what it can do, what we can expect of it. It's important to locate it within that body. So it is not a freestanding institution that preaches international law. It is a part of the General Assembly family.
Okay. And we'll come back a little bit more to the sort of, I guess, outputs of the International Law Commission and sort of who it's speaking to, I guess, in its work. But could you say a little bit more about how you became a member of the International Law Commission? What's the kind of process that that involves?
So it is an elected position. I was elected by the General Assembly of the United Nations in late 2021. It was one of those things that took an awful amount of time, and if it had done slightly differently, probably would not be a very pleasant thing to remember. Now it just seems like a very entertaining yarn and important, I suppose, process for appreciating how seriously states take it. A majority vote of the General Assembly. There are 34 members of the International Law Commission that are allocated to 5 regional groups: Western European Group, Eastern European Group, in relation to which I was elected, GRULAC, the Caribbean and Latin American Group, African Group, and Asia Pacific Group. And every group has a certain number of allocated seats that rotate yearly. There's one seat that is rotating between the Eastern European Group and African Group. and one seat that is rotating between a Latin American group and Asian group. And the competition is solely within the group. So that, I think, is a contrast with the International Court of Justice, for example, where seats are traditionally allocated, but ultimately there might be the sort of unpleasantness as happened in 2017, where the election of the General Assembly and the Security Council does not exactly replicate traditional allocation. So that is something that could not happen in the International Law Commission. People are running and competing solely in that setting. I think the process, I suppose, was a rather interesting one. Nominations are made by states. They can be singular states or multiple states. I was nominated by the three Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. The period of nomination is 1 year before the election. So the election took place in early November 2021, and the nomination was in November 2020, and really for the whole year, in addition to the wonderful working environment at UCL, because there was for a couple of months that every evening when I would finish sort of at 4 or 5-ish, the classes and all the other exciting things that we do at UCL, when people in New York would be waking up, then I would be starting lots of calls with particular countries who wanted to hear why they should vote for me in that setting. So again, something that was, that is an entertaining story because it worked. Possibly, if it had not, it would have been slightly more painful pitch.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that you're nominated by the Baltic states, and I guess ILC members are nominated by at least one country. But their role is not to be a representative of their country of nomination, is it? Although there's a sense in which they're supposed to be representative of legal tradition or a system more broadly. Is that right?
That is absolutely right. So that is a slight peculiarity of the International Law Commission, that even though many of its members are current or former senior officials of their particular countries, so in the UK, for example, Sir Michael Wood, the previous member of the International Law Commission, was a legal advisor, formerly of the United Kingdom's Foreign Office, and historically, many of the International Law Commission's members, Gerald Fitzmaurice, for example, were also senior officials. But in that particular setting, they're acting in personal capacity and are independent from states. At the same time, of course, it is a great benefit that they can bring their professional experience and background. You're right to point that they are, in a way, representing certain considerations. Just you get this very, very helpful thing that the codification division of United Nations is publishing and updating regularly, and so it has everything related to international Law Commission. And in the statute, it says that in Article 8, the Commission as a whole should represent the main forms of civilization and of the principal legal systems of the world. So civilization on its own, perhaps somewhat problematic term, but at least the main legal systems of the world, something that is quite explicitly replicated in the requirement for regional representation that I was speaking of, I think is really a very valuable and important element of the International Law Commission, that is a genuinely generalist, universalist institution, as very few other institutions, perhaps, except for the International Court of Justice is.
Do you feel like there's a sort of, I don't know, ever a kind of tension between the idea that you're representing a particular legal tradition and the idea that you're there as a kind of internationalist, as a sort of citizen of the world? Probably not. You mentioned kind of Jeremy Bentham in some of the Jeremy Bentham was mentioned in some of the promotional material for this event because he was an early promoter of the codification of international law, and he also wrote about the difficulty of codification because his problem or the challenge that he identified was that the codifier would have to come from some particular state, and what was to stop them just representing the interests of their state when it came to codifying international law. And I suppose that's always a kind of question with international organizations or these kinds of processes, to what extent people can kind of detach themselves from their particular set of backgrounds or interests, or even whether they should, whether instead we have a kind of collective process where everything gets aggregated and it doesn't really matter if people are representing particular backgrounds.
I think that is, so it is a hard question, and it really goes to the core of the debate about where ILC fits and whether it really works. And probably one perhaps slightly modest point to make here is that the International Law Commission is, of course, not the only place that deals with international law. There are many places where people are engaging with generalist issues without any political context, at least in institutional sense at all. So Institut de Droit International would be an example where sort of one might say that there is something that is more sharply removed from the political context, where there is greater emphasis on the sort of academic independence and perhaps, as you put it, the citizen of the world in a good sense, which is, I suppose we must say, in this cultural space. To me, it has always struck me that that is really the power of the International Law Commission, that is perhaps a bit messier, part of the broader international legal process of the United Nations, and the ability of people to bring their experience and appreciation of particular regional, national, or professional traditions will improve the quality of the product and will increase the likelihood that it actually ultimately does work, that it is received favorably by states in the General Assembly and by tribunals and states in the broader setting. So in a sense, if it is something that is completely unacceptable to an important constituency, it is good that is appreciated already in the Commission rather than when it goes to the Sixth Committee or to international court. So in a sense, that probably my answer slightly hedges, but that International Law Commission is a reflection of the reality of the lawmaking process, and to the extent that is an accurate one, it is a good thing to have.
Interesting. And just to kind of follow up, like the ILC members aren't all academics, are they? Like some of them are people with more of a background in diplomacy or in government work. So you do have a mixture of different sort of, I guess, perspectives and backgrounds there that inform the work of the ILC, some of which bring more of a kind of state perspective or a governmental perspective on that role. Yeah.
That is absolutely right. I think that one might think of perhaps it as a spectrum at the one end, a truly detached academic lawyer, and at the other end, somebody who is completely entrenched in practice and has no academic pretensions on engagement. And I think probably all of the colleagues that I can think of to some extent fall somewhere in the middle, that it's, more likely that people who have a full-time academic job, the United Kingdom is particularly strongly represented as a place of residence, so to speak, of three ILC members, Dapar Kande, the United Kingdom's member, and Phoebe O'Connor-Kenny's member. We'll have our academic positions. At the same time, we have a bit of the sense of the reality of international law outside the classroom. And at the other end of the spectrum, there will be people who are current or former legal advisors, so really predominantly practicing lawyers, but also, again, people who have delivered Hague Academy lectures or who publish in journals and speak in conference. So I think that there are a few people, whatever their entrance point is, that would be entirely oblivious of the other side.
People probably come in from different parts of the spectrum, but probably drift somewhere towards the middle in terms of the processes of the ILC, I suppose, and having to work with people from different sort of backgrounds as well.
Right, and I think that to the extent that ILC works to try to form a consensus view on these matters, perhaps in some extent one might say that one would play to their strength, that if there is an ILC member who has been for decades a Security Council permanent member's legal advisor, naturally, that with all the best will in the world, I couldn't really replicate the level of familiarity with certain matters that they would have. And probably conversely, that there are certain academic matters that might be harder for practitioners to replicate, but to the extent that the debate about drafting and about how it might be received in different constituencies, academic, practical, in universal bodies, regional bodies, I think that it really is where that is. I think the statute puts it rather nicely that there are individual qualifications that need to be satisfied, competence in international law, but it is a body as a whole that has to represent these different traditions and experiences and backgrounds. And that, I think, is a fairly accurate summary of how it works, at least in my view.
That does put it nicely, I think. Just one more thing on the ILC members before we move on, really. Are there any requirements for sort of diversity apart from geographical, the sort of geographical diversity that naturally comes out of the different kind of groupings that you mentioned? When you look around the ILC room, does it feel reflective of the world?
That is a good question. And again, I think one of the hard questions. And you're right that the statute does not tell us a great deal. It's a document that was drafted in 1947, where I think the really normative assumptions of diversity were perhaps with somewhat different emphasis than in 2023. It does say that members should be persons of recognized competence in international law. There's a bit of a discussion what recognized means in that sense. Jumping a bit ahead, it was in the topic on subsidiary means for determination of rules of international law. And in drafting the conclusion on teachings, the question was how to articulate the requirement of competence. And one suggestion, it's reflected in the chairpersons of the drafting committee report, was to use the same formulation, recognized competence. But there was pushback, and people felt that by using it, some people might read it that only people of the caliber that are elected in the International Law Commission or the International Court of Justice count as publicists. There's really very strong pressure to be much more open, including the high quality contributions from early career researchers. I think, a good point for our wonderful PhD students. So in that setting, it's interesting that the word recognized has disappeared. So just people with competence.
It'd be something a little bit suspicious if the International Law Commission determined that only members of the International Law Commission were highly qualified publicists.
Right. So they would be kind of like, that's sort of they're a bit of the yes minister that, of course, we are the very, wide section of the international society. And other than that, it's really, we have the reference to the principal legal systems. General Assembly Resolution 73/341 from 2019 encouraged states to nominate members for subsidiary bodies of the General Assembly in a way to ensure gender balance. And there were several nominations. Currently, I believe there are 6 out of 34 members of the International Law Commission that are female. The chairs of the International Law Commission this year are Patricia Galvot-Hellesch and Nilofer Oral. So occupied plainly very prominent positions. They have been special rapporteurs and members of the study group. But I think ultimately that seems like the right way where to locate it. It's at the level of nomination by states and ultimately as a result of the electoral process. Because there are also several formidable female candidates who were not elected. I think simply 3 were not elected. So ultimately, the ultimate judgment call is on the General Assembly.
The states in who they nominate and who they vote for in the General Assembly processes.
Yeah.
You mentioned a little bit earlier that the ILC tries to work towards consensus, and I just wanted to ask a little bit about how decisions are made in a general sense. At least, consensus is obviously the ideal. Is consensus always the sort of way in which decisions are made, or are sometimes decisions made based on a kind of majority basis? Or if you don't reach consensus, does that mean that the topic is sort of already too controversial and there are already too many doubts for it to kind of advance in that sort of state?
Right. So that is a great question. I was quite pleased myself that this year, under my wise guidance, even if I said so myself, all the decisions of the drafting committee were reached by consensus. At the same time, as my wonderful undergraduate students with whom I will be dealing with the topic of immunities next week will know, in some famous occasions, International Law Commission has voted in 2017. The International Law Commission voted on draft Article 7 on the question on whether there were any exceptions to the ratiare materia immunities, in particular in relation to international crimes. And the reactions from states in the 6th committee were overall critical. So states felt that consensus, consensual decision-making is still the better way of proceeding in that matter. I think that one practical takeaway that I had is that consensus there's a wonderful ambiguity about the concept. So it's better perhaps not to try to pin it down too clearly, but there are many ways for indicating disagreement on the substance without quite reaching the stage of not adopting the decision or blocking the decision. I think that there are various ways for members to indicate their personal views in the initial plenary discussion that would be streamed in 6 languages on your web TV and then reflected in summary records. Members set out their initial views on the matter. Then the matter goes, if these provisions are referred to the drafting committee, as they now almost invariably are, that goes to a closed discussion. But then after that discussion, the chairperson of the drafting committee reads out a statement which summarizes in possibly slightly anodyne form the rigorous discussion that was had. And in that summary, reference is also made to other views that were expressed, even if they were ultimately not adopted. And there are these very subtle ways of putting it. So if there's just a few people who say something, some members express the view. If there was 3 or more members, perhaps a very significant part, several members express the view. So a careful reader who is preparing the statement of the state for the 6th committee might say, well, this is what the drafting committee said, but I know that several members took a different view, and I think that, those are sensible members. You should listen more to several members rather than the consensus decision. And then ultimately, in the very end, in the last 2 weeks, when commentaries are adopted, then members can also come in and explain. Again, sometimes it's a rather lively discussion on their understanding and their preferences. And again, these could be sort of various ways of indicating personal substantive disagreement, but without stopping the consensual process. And at least in this year's session, overall it worked. There were points where people disagreed, even quite strongly disagreed, but there was always a sense that there are ways of identifying that preference in a way that doesn't require a vote or blocking the process, because ultimately the legal process never ends. So the Sixth Committee comments, then next year the International Law Commission comes back, possibly takes a slightly different emphasis. Eventually there will be a second reading. So the constructive character of the process, there'll always be another day to argue.
Allows you to move on and, record things and keep, nevertheless, keep making progress with the work. Yeah.
Well, precisely, because ILC is just one part of the bigger legal process. It may be that there are some things that are picked up in domestic courts or international courts or elsewhere, United Nations. So this is not, not everything turns on this.
I don't want to get too bogged down in ILC procedures because there's obviously substantive things to talk about and actually some interesting topics about the sort of nature of the ILC's work. But could you just take briefly what the drafting committee does? Because you've been elected as chair of the drafting committee, which is a singular honor and responsibility, I think we can say. And just how does the drafting committee fit into the work of the ILC in particular?
Right. So there's a slightly secretive part. It is not something that is put on web TV. So for every topic, it essentially works in the same way. That first, at some point in February, March, around that time, rapporteurs sent around their reports. Then it usually takes a bit of time until they are translated in all the official United Nations languages and set out publicly. But then the first thing that ILC members do, they deliver their statements in the plenary. It's one of those things that, one of those secretive things that new members are not always necessarily told, but it's important to come there prepared. It's a 20-minute, fairly substantial statement on the issue. And after everybody has done that, and the rapporteur has responded and explained their position on the matter, then the question is whether there is sufficient consensus for the particular provisions that have been proposed to be referred to the drafting committee. And in practice, it almost invariably is so. Then drafting committee convenes and looks at only the proposed provisions, and really in rather fine detail. It may be that a couple of days are required to adopt a sentence. When we're working in parallel in English, French, and Spanish, has to be really just right, that everybody's happy with it, with all the possible qualifications, and substantively the point is the same, and the Anglophone, Francophone, and Spanish-speaking colleagues are on the same page. So that is probably where the greatest degree of intellectual energy goes in. Then, the world at large does not know the detail of that discussion, but then the chairperson delivers a public statement to the plenary, which once again is streamed and recorded, and everybody can read it. So that is, it was very fortunate that this was the chairperson of the drafting committee is one of the big 5 square positions in the ILC. 5 has almost a slightly magical number. 5 regional groups, 5 years of the ILC, 5 members of the bureau. Chair, 2 vice chairs, general rapporteur who works on the non-substantive chapters of the annual report, and the chair of the drafting committee. And it so happened that this was the Eastern European group's year, and after an internal discussion in the group, it was decided that, for a variety of reasons, my colleagues entrusted me to be the chair.
And we're all very fortunate they did. I want to turn a little bit to ask about what topics the ILC works on. and really, how is it decided, first of all, what its subjects of inquiry are going to be? So it's self-select, is it asked questions by another body?
There's a significant degree of flexibility, and ultimately I think it was initially thought that the General Assembly would be fairly active in that regard and that states would be fairly active. In practice, that has not proved to be the case, with some very prominent exceptions, in particular recently in relation to sea level rise, where several small island states very actively took the lead in that matter. Micronesia and Vanuatu in particular, but mostly this is something that is discussed in the long-term working group of the Commission, where members present possible topics. If the working group is persuaded about a particular topic, it is put in the long-term program, and it is printed as an annex to the annual report, after which states in the October 6th committee meeting can react. I think it's, a great thing to do, or, nothing much to write home about. And depending on what they have said, then the next year, International Law Commission will return again and decide whether to put it on the current working program. And then the year after that, the rapporteur produces the first report. So there's a sort of a 3-4 year waiting period.
So the initiative can come from states, but even if it comes from within the International Law Commission, it sort of has to get the approval of states as a topic that you should be working on, at least in a sort of broad sense, that this is encouraged by states.
Right. I mean, I think so. We know what the criteria are for a selection of topics, and there are 4. It has to be something that states are interested in a broad sense, something on which there is sufficient practice to engage in codification of progressive data, and something on which ILC could provide a helpful output. And then, so the 4th is really more of a caveat that openness to new topics. Just because something hasn't been done in the ILC doesn't mean that it shouldn't be done. And I think in practice, these things can also be balanced a bit as well. So sea level rise, for example, was something, again, before my time, so I can only speculate from indirect in this year, but I think the general sense was that there was extremely strong sense that it was important for states. Possibly in terms of state practice, it was somewhat at an early stage, but overall taking together all these considerations, it was selected as a topic. So I think, again, it's also interesting, and I think it goes perhaps to the point that you alluded to, who the ultimate constituency is. And within the United Nations family is clearly the General Assembly, and particularly its 6th committee. And interestingly, I think some topics that have been received very favorably in academia as something that ILC has done a good job on and that should have been done is not necessarily replicated among states, and vice versa. So it's, the question of the ultimate audience is an interesting one.
That question of the audience, is that affected by the nature of the output that's produced by the ILC? Because this is one thing that's changed a little bit in the history of the ILC, that in its early decades it focused on producing what we call hard law treaties for adoption by states, and it had a great deal of success in that. But it's been kind of documented that there's been a bit of a shift more towards producing principles, sort of soft law instruments. And one thing about soft law instruments is that they don't necessarily speak just to states. They speak to potentially international courts and tribunals, domestic courts and tribunals, other actors who have to interpret and understand international law in their sort of day-to-day work. And I wonder if the nature of that output, and potentially the different audience that it might be speaking, that it might speak to, sort of affects the approach of the ILC and its work.
That is a very interesting question. I think and perhaps really the bigger constitutional question, so to speak, is about the relationship between the Commission and the Sixth Legal Committee. The Legal Council of the United Nations, Chairperson, has a number of times expressed a view on the correctness of which I express myself no view, but he has been publicly reported as saying that Sixth Committee is where ILC products go to die. And I mean, it's not perhaps put a bit strongly, but you know, you are very right to note that there hasn't been a steady stream of treaty adoption, so to speak, since we know that in the Cold War times, Vienna Convention of Law Treaties, Geneva Conventions on Law of the Sea, variety of Vienna Conventions on succession, diplomatic, consular relations, statelessness, and so on. I think it's worth noting that even in those times, there are also very important documents that were not treaties. So Nuremberg Principles, for example, or the draft code of arbitral procedure, but mostly it really was going through that route. And there's a variety of considerations there. And I think the questions being asked by some states, United States has been particularly forceful in articulating the question of what the difference between these things really is. So does it matter whether something is a conclusion or guiding principles, or is it an aesthetic choice? Is that a normative choice? And there is a working group on working methods that is looking, as it were, what is it that it is looking at? There's a multiplicity of considerations, but I think at least in terms of the statute, probably the idea is that the essential work obligation of dealing with progressive development and codification has not changed. So that is still the core forms of output and success. I think that the general sense is that it is really up to states to decide what happens afterwards. So I will, try not to comment on wisdom or preference of particular approaches. It's still about the essential job is still the same.
And one final sort of general question. I know we're kind of already time is flying, but the progressive development and the codification of international law. So those are two quite different functions. As academics, we're quite used to recognizing that there are quite two different things that we might be doing. We have a kind of technical hat-on where we're identifying what the law is as a kind of technical legal analyst professional. And then you have a kind of development of the law hat-on where you make arguments from policy or from some other kind of normative justification about what the law should be. And, we see those as two quite different functions. How do those functions fit together in the work of the ILC? Are they, if I understand correctly, the statute of the ILC sort of formally anticipated that they would be separate, but in practice, they're not really separate. They're sort of more merged in a single process.
Right. So it is absolutely right. I think so in practice, the statute does seem, as you very rightly point out, it even has separate sub-chapters on progressive development and codification. One interesting thing is that what the statute calls progressive development is not what we call progressive development. It has a very different understanding. So Article 15 says that progressive development is the preparation of a draft convention on subjects which have not yet been regulated by international law, on regard to which the law has not yet been sufficiently developed in the practice of states. So I think it really sort of goes to your point that it doesn't seem to be contemplating the sort of things as articles on state responsibility, where a progressive development is, as you say, perhaps we're running a bit ahead of the lawmaking train, but something that might then be accepted by states or courts and tribunals and such. So this really ultimately is actually a fairly conservative and state-respectful idea of progressive development, that we are rushing a bit ahead, but ultimately it is through the treaty-making process that this will be picked up. So it's not the progressive development that, use slightly colloquial metaphor, is directly injected in the bloodstream of international law without going through the Sixth Committee or a specialized conference. So that is an interesting point. I think there are different schools of thought on how easily one can distinguish it. I'm actually probably one of those who thinks that is an important analytical distinction to keep in mind, even if it's a complicated one to implement in practice. And I was discussing it as one senior former member, and I said, well, you sometimes hear it said that they're also intermeshed and you cannot distinguish it. But so are we really suggesting that Judge Tomka, Judge Schuer, Judge Benuna, the late and much missed Judge Crawford, could not distinguish between what is law and what is not law in Geneva, and then they went to the Peace Palace and had to decide cases, and then they could distinguish it? I mean, why is that the case? And then that person said, well, the judges are paid a bit better than the international law members, and that is a response. But I don't think that really speaks to the analytical point. It is important. States take it seriously. Courts take it seriously as well, particularly when they look at the ILC outputs and seem to be capable of distinguishing it. I think that is probably something that will be discussed in some detail in comments that states will be submitting by this Friday on the draft articles on immunities. And so that's this is a point on which reasonable people disagree.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to get to some of the substantive sort of things that have been worked on this year, and there'll be a huge amount of time, so we'll have to sort of touch on them. General principles of law is one that's been worked on quite a bit. General principles of law and international law, of course, having sort of potentially two different meanings. General principles as derived from the states or the sort of common legal systems of the world. Or general principles that are derived from international law itself. I know that the International Law Commission is sort of working on both those conceptions, but there's a certain amount of controversy around, what our understanding of general principles should be. I wonder if that's something that you can sort of speak to and how the ILC has been engaging with that issue.
Right. And so this year, the ILC adopted the draft conclusions on general principles of law in the first reading. Actually, I think, as it were, in a small friendly company, can say that in reality it had been adopted already last year. There was no rediscussion of the substance of the conclusions, but procedurally speaking, the ILC didn't have time to adopt the full commentaries last year. And so formally speaking, it was adopted only this year, although the drafting committee really dealt with it in an hour or so. There was just what the process called codification final, just slightly finessing the multilingual aspects. Commentaries were adopted. So I think that the newly elected ILC members found themselves in a slightly peculiar situation of discussing commentaries, something that they had not been privy in discussion on the substance. And you're right that there are the two categories, the more sort of commonly accepted idea of principles derived from domestic legal traditions, though importantly, the adjective civilized has now been dropped and replaced by the community of nations, which was, I think, broadly well received. I think states welcomed the methodological suggestions of genuinely universal engagement with domestic legal traditions. And I think in the discussion on the commentary, I slightly cleaned up the footnotes, deleting the bit of investment arbitration decisions, which possibly fall below that standard of quality required. But the controversial question was the second one, as you said, the general principles of law intrinsic sort of to the international community. And there had been fairly significant disagreement among the ILC members in formulating that. And there's also a diversity of views, but there were some questions raised by states in their reactions in the Sixth Committee. And so that is something that ILC will return to in 2 years. And I guess perhaps again, without prejudicing my own position, I think the question that states are asking is on the extent to which that adds or dilutes the usual criteria for identifying customer international law. So is there an added value there? Because of course, custom requires all of those very, very diligent materials to be identified. But there are also good responses provided by the Special Rapporteur, and there are examples provided in the commentary. So I think that that will be certainly something to watch in 2 years.
Excellent. You've touched already on subsidiary means for the determination of rules of international law. Again, sort of one of these very core topics that the ILC is still working on, you know, the sort of very basic sources questions that are still being confronted by the ILC in its work. There are a couple of things. So that there's some proposed draft conclusions that have been presented there, and there are a couple of things that sort of really struck me in those, and I wondered, you know, if you could sort of talk about how the ILC sort of discussions on those. One is the idea that particular regard should be had to decisions of the International Court of Justice compared with other courts, sort of suggesting a kind of hierarchy of courts in international law, which is something that I think isn't something that's necessarily obviously there. James Crawford, in his capacity as legal representative of Australia in the Australian v East Timor litigation before the ICJ, sort of famously told the judges of the ICJ before he later joined them as a judge that you are nothing special. You know, you are just a court. And he was arguing that they should defer to a separate arbitral tribunal, which had been seized with related issues. And he sort of stood up before the court and said, you don't have any special status in international law. You are just a judicial body like every other international judicial body. But there's something different being recognized here about the role of the ICJ as a kind of apex court in international law. I thought that was quite interesting.
Right. So that was one of the things that were subject to discussion. And different people took different views. In my own plenary intervention, my sense was that, you know, the peculiarity of rules on rules, so to speak, is that they are agnostic on the institutions, and they are mostly applied actually without reference to any institutions at all. So there is that element of peculiarity. At the same time, the work on subsidiary means is quite heavily influenced by the ILC conclusions on identification of customary international law. And a similar formula had been adopted in that setting and was felt had been received quite favorably by states. That they were not concerns expressed of that sort. It was noted, and it comes up in my statement, that recognizing the importance, but not necessarily of a hierarchical character, it is a primary judicial organ of the United Nations. Some members noted that it might very much depend on the substantive issue raised, and they're particularly within regional and specialized settings. So we can think, for example, of the European Union law, that there may be other courts that are usually leading the way. But I think ultimately in balancing all of those considerations, the idea of consistency across projects was also a consideration that, you know, states might say, all right, so ICJ, it's not as great as it was in 2018. So, you know, as I said, the beauty of the consensual decision-making process, that different considerations form the ultimate result.
And there's lots of other sort of topics that the ILC has been working on that we could discuss, but I wonder if we should, given the time, open it up to any questions that anyone has. Does anyone have anything they'd like to ask Martins? Yes.
Just wanted to give other people a chance, but never mind. Good evening. My name is Kavita. It's such a pleasure to hear you speak again, Professor. My question is fairly simple. In terms of where there are so many emerging issues that are coming up, in your practice at the ILC now, what do you think would be challenges that you would face in terms of states or in terms of negotiating with people who do not come, say, from an academic background, but rather practitioners? So what are challenges and how do you see yourself overcoming those?
Just for the benefit of people online, the question really is about the challenge as, I guess, an academic work in the ILC of engaging with people from a non-academic background, or the work of the ILC dealing with states or others sort of who aren't coming from that sort of perspective.
That is a great question. I have to say that one thing that I have to say I greatly enjoy the fact how much my illusions, perhaps of particular insight that academics have on international law, were mostly demolished, and the sense of really the depth of appreciation and insight that practitioners bring to really systemic foundational issues was quite. I wasn't necessarily surprised, but it was certainly confirmed the sense that perhaps the perspective of academics in some Western countries that might think that international law doesn't really exist or is not taken seriously by states is certainly precisely as silly as it sounds. In fact, if we look at the recent projects on foundational questions, customary international law, Michael Wood, general principles of law, Marcelo Vasquez Bermudez, current and former legal advisors, really practitioners. I did not really feel the sort of sharp delineation between people who come at it from academia or legal advisors office. Really the metaphor of a spectrum where it's probably there are lots of Venn diagrams, and there are very few people who have no overlapping assumptions at all. So there were certain challenges, but that was not one of those. So on that thing, I have to say I was quite pleased with our experience.
Any other questions? One back there first, I think.
I have a question about the respective merits of the IELTS engaging with cross-cutting and general topics of international law, and then specific ones, and whether you have a view as to sort of whether it's better to focus on general topics because they can contribute to multiple branches of international law as opposed to engage in specific topics.
So, sorry, for the benefit of those online, the question is whether it's better for the ILC to focus on the sort of general cross-cutting topics or on the more specific topics. And obviously, it does a mixture of those in terms of its work.
And that, I think, is really the answer that, I do think that the particular structural considerations that inform the composition of the ILC, genuine universality and emphasis on generalism, makes it particularly suitable in working on the generalist questions. So sources and responsibility, I think, is a particular strength. At the same time, there are also very important specialist issues. So sea level rise is one of those. Although again, we might say a particular topic is taken and then consider in a very generalist analytical perspective, statehood, human rights, maritime boundaries. So there needs to be a mixture of both. And I don't think that that's, that there's an a priori right balance. It reflects the needs of the international community. And so in that sense, it is not surprising that throughout and after the decolonization process, there was great demand for revisiting and examination of foundational rules with the genuine entirety of the international community dealing with them. And it may be that if process is working much better in the political world or in specialized organizations, that ILC is not duplicating the work that somebody else is doing. I think that there sort of needs to be a certain sensitivity of engaging in projects that can wait for a couple of years, that are not incredibly speedy, that are not incredibly specialized, an examination by a body composed by the people of the sort that are there. So, but these are certainly the right questions to ask.
Question there? Yeah.
Congratulations again on your election. Do you sense there's any appetite or not amongst members of the ILC to take on any projects that may influence or nudge the direction of investment treaty law? I was trying to think of an example, and the first one that came to mind was the minimum standard, to define the minimum standard.
So the question is whether there might be any appetite for the ILC to take up work that might influence the direction of international investment more, like, for example, the minimum standard of treatment.
That is a good question. I think I will be a bit circumspect in how I answer it, but it will be historically Stefan Bassiani, the Jamaican member who had written probably the first and greatest article on penetrable treatment, the British Yearbook, before it all kicked off, proposed penetrable treatment as a possible topic. Sort of about 15, I think it's 2011, 2012. States were not greatly interested. So I think 5 or 6 states responded. I think France and US said, well, it's all very specialized and very treaty specific. Singapore was the only one that said, well, we're not in favor, we're not against, we might wait it out. And ultimately, I think it's really a question of that sort of the sense of systemic fit. Is that the right place in the international community for that to be addressed? It's certainly something that, ILC can deal with fairly narrow substantive issues. So piracy and armed robbery at sea, which is being addressed now, is fairly narrowly focused. And the question is really, what do states think? It's certainly perfectly conceivable, a very classic question of international law, sort of touched upon here and there in various projects, starting from the early days of state responsibility. It's almost like it's with a common law answer that it's not an a priori point, it's a question of whether it fits in that particular place.
Other questions? Yes.
Hello, thank you for speaking tonight. I was wondering, having chaired the drafting committee, does the committee sometimes fear that its function of progressively developing the law clashes with its function of codification, in that it made the most progressive propositions may deter states from adopting draft articles as a whole?
So is there sometimes a sort of fear that the progressive development function and the codification function might be in tension, because the more that the law is progressively developed, the less likely states are to accept it as a codification?
That is an excellent question, and that is a very hard question. It's likely something that would be discussed next year in relation to unities. So I think as a general matter, there are a number of things that are at play. One of those also relates to form of output, because of course one could put it the other way around, that if ILC goes in the very traditional route of proposing a draft convention with content, let us assume that significantly departs from custom, a state that is greatly dissatisfied with the substance of the proposal actually shouldn't feel that uncomfortable. It would say, well, it is a draft treaty, and I will not ratify that draft treaty as long as everybody is on the same page that this is not reflective of custom, it's a progressive development that may or may not be adopted, maybe, that's fine. And in a way, the law of transboundary watercourses, that is one of the most recent treaties that were actually adopted on the basis of the ILC work in 1997, was very heavily criticized by states during adoption, and it came into force, and it was recognized by the ICJ as having influenced customary law. But in a way, that's sort of perhaps the argument for states that actually dislike certain projects to engage actively with them in the lawmaking process, because Otherwise, there could be a danger that ILC output, well, a danger for those who think that it's a danger. Others might think that it's a great thing, but that ILC products could, as it were, go directly into international courts and tribunals, while if they are made a starting point for a negotiated convention, the states might have another opportunity to engage with them. Probably just really the last point to say here, that is really the great advantage of practitioners or recent practitioners being on the Commission. There's a good sense of what the international community of states as a whole would be happy with. Academics might really be perhaps speculating sometimes what is it that states will stomach or not. Yes.
Yes, question there.
Well, the articles on state responsibility, are they now part of customary international law? That's one question. And I don't know what time you're going to be leaving. There's a question I would like to ask you after. A theoretical question.
So the first question was whether the articles on state responsibility should now be considered customary international law, and another great achievement of the International Law Commission.
And James Crawford, which did many things. I think I would probably be a bit more cautious, and one would probably have to consider these provision by provision. Many of them have been recognized by most bodies as reflective of customary international law, but not all of them. A great deal turns on application, a great deal turns on scope. So, obviously raise the question of investment law, and we know that there's that commonly hidden paragraph 2 of Article 33, which makes all the rules on content of responsibility, including compensation, without prejudice to human rights and investment law. So I think that there are lots of interesting qualifications hidden inside, and what is progressive development and what is codification is on its own immovable piece. James Crawford, I think, quite famously said that he was quite surprised in 2007 to see that the ICJ recognized Article 16 or 8 or assistance to be reflective of customary law, because when they're finalizing it, he felt that if there was something that was progressive development, that was that. And this is a point on which reasonable people might disagree. So if we look at the rules expressed in Article 41, they were described regarding not rendering aid or assistance or not recognizing when fundamental breaches, when serious breach of US law have taken place, explicitly described progressive development in the 2001 articles. In more recent work on draft conclusion, the US law is described as codificatory, but those conclusions themselves are still draft conclusions, because the states haven't yet been able in 2 years to agree to reach consensus on their attachment as annexes. So these are extremely hard questions. And again, a very encouraging way that these things that may seem awfully theoretical, states do spend an inordinate amount of time thinking extremely seriously about them. So that's, there is value for us international lawyers.
And we're running over time a little bit, but the gentleman at the back there has been very patient, so I'll take him as the last question.
Hi, my name is Nicole. Thank you for this talk. I've really enjoyed it so far. I understand you specialize in international investment law, but as an ILC associate, what are your thoughts on international humanitarian law? Whether it's been successful in recent years and in general, and perhaps how it should be amended.
So the question is about international humanitarian law and whether how we might judge that as a body of law, and whether there might be any prospect for amendment, perhaps whether it might be in certain respects a suitable subject for the ILC to work on.
That's a good question. I think it probably goes back to the point about the fit of a project within the International Law Commission, and that we have to ask whether there's a better suited body somewhere else that is particularly specializing in it, because states and institutions are very pragmatic and they don't like work being duplicated. My instinctive inclination, and there are many greater experts in humanitarian law in the room, is that probably there are other places in the bigger international lawmaking process where the point is better put, perhaps, just across the road from the United Nations building, there is ICRC that does an extraordinary amount of interesting work. So I think it's more likely that these are points that could come up incidentally in considering particular topics. So of course, humanitarian law also raises extremely interesting questions of generalist character. So I mentioned ICRC. Alex mentioned the work on subsidiary means. So where does ICRC fit within that process is an interesting question that ILC will return to. It may come up in particular specialized topics. So there was a topic recently concluded on environmental protection on conflict where humanitarian law was considered. So that would, if I had to crystal ball it, that would be my answer. Probably not straight on, but as any field of international law, it can helpfully contribute to other topics.
Fantastic. And one very final question from me. What have you enjoyed most so far about being an ILC member? What's been the sort of most positive experience or aspect of it?
Well, it has been all enormously good fun. I have to say that I really enjoyed being challenged all the time. Of course, we are challenged by wonderful students, by our very wonderful colleagues, and everybody who we meet. But there might be sometimes a bit of a sense, at least, I'm not generalizing, speaking about myself, that one plays to one's strengths and comfort. In the ILC, that is not possible. The beauty is that I can't think of, possibly James Crawford, but a few other people would be experts on every topic from settlement of disputes with organizations to piracy to sea level rise to foundational questions and immunities. So really being forced to form my opinion on foundational questions of international law that I would not necessarily have done it for myself, that has been enormously good fun.
Wonderful. Thank you again, Martin, for speaking with us. I think we've all found it extremely interesting and insightful. And congratulations again on your election, and very best of luck for the years of work to come.
Thank you very much, Alex.